Okay, welcome back. Sean again. We're going to look at critical thinking and decision-making in ethics. So at the end of this lecture, you'll be able to make perfect ethical decisions every single time. I wish. Now, what this is really about is offering a tool to you to assist with ethical decision-making and also to make you realise maybe what biases that you may have and to make you consider how you might ground your decisions in the context of where you are. So moral decision-making is really, really hard. And, it's not so simple that you can apply the principles of a bunch of dead philosophers to every single thing that you see and make correct decisions that suit everybody. What's the purpose of making moral decisions at the bedside or moral decisions in healthcare? There's many reasons why you might do so. Primarily, it's about, ethics is about that human flourishing. It's predominantly about person-centered care. It's predominantly about the patient, but it's also about us as clinicians. It's about the healthcare team, being satisfied and comfortable with moral and ethical decision making. It's also about you. You need to be comfortable with what decisions that you make. And often the moral concerns that arise from healthcare decisions don't impact you until a long time later. And they can be decisions which stay with you for a long time. So it's really important to make grounded decisions that are ethical, but also recognize that we are imperfect as human beings and we don't always make the best decisions. And the idea is to keep growing as ethical decision makers. All right. Now, firstly, moral reasoning is like any other kind of critical thinking. You need to consider and to analyze the problem and analyze your own thinking about the problem. You need to think, what are my biases? What is my own moral intuition? This is reflection, and this kind of reflection is really important, not just obviously in ethics, but also in clinical work as well. So in a clinical or healthcare ethical problem, the values, perspectives, and history of the patient, family, and other clinicians must be considered, must be respected, and must be evaluated as part of your deliberations. The two essential personal qualities that you must manifest are empathy and compassion. So it's not so different from making clinical decisions, which also demand that kind of thinking. You must acknowledge that others have differing points of view about the problem. And the goal is not to get your way, but the goal is to make sound ethical decisions in the best interests of all concerned. You must, though, make judgments upon the relevant and salient points of the problem, and you must have the capacity to judge their worth and to compare them. Anyway, in the reading of this session, you'll see a printout of a model for ethical problem solving in clinical medicine. It comes from the textbook Kerridge, Lowe and Stewart. To be honest, this is as good as any tool that I've ever seen. I won't go through it in ultimate detail, but the headings are really well thought out. So let's look at the headings. Firstly, identify the ethical problem. Is it an ethical problem? Identify the components of the dilemma or components of the problem that are ethical. All right, so you can reason about them ethically. Separate them somewhat from the clinical problems if you can. Also get the clinical facts about the issue, because obviously the clinical facts might determine the ethical problem. Consider core ethical principles. So remembering in Western healthcare, some of our guiding principles is principalism. So have a look at, beneficence, non-maleficence, respect for autonomy, and justice. See what the answer is to the dilemma using those core principles. And then consider how the problem would look from another perspective or using another theory. I guess similarly to what I did above, have a look at deontology, have a look at consequentialism or utilitarianism, but virtue ethics even. And then identify ethical conflicts that might occur within those different theories. Now, when you're looking at other perspectives, have a look at other persons' perspectives. Talk to the family if it's appropriate or if there's time or whether it's relevant. Have to collaborate with other clinicians to get their perspectives or points of view on the matter. This is really important. Remember, it's not about winning an argument. It's about getting the best ethical outcome in the best interests of the patient and everyone involved. Consider the law. What does the law say? I mean, many ethical problems have legal considerations. And as if you make a decision which is in conflict with the law, that leaves you and your clinicians at risk. All right, so that's a real consideration there. The law is also part of ethics, and it's really hard to explain how the two intersect, but they both inform each other. So something which is safe in law can inform our ethics. And finally, identify a way forward. As I've previously described, the way forward is about a pragmatic decision in the best interests of all concerned, but particularly the patient and their family. Now, obviously, this is great if you've got a week, just like you're writing an ethical assignment on yourself. But you often might be put on the spot and you have to rely on intuition, or perhaps even just default to principlism if in doubt. Now, I really want you to consider the nursing code of conduct and the nursing standards. And in those, it says that we're obliged to use an ethical framework. But what ethical framework? Okay, so that's you to work out, you collaborating with the healthcare team to work out. And I think it's about being able to come up with good moral reasoning and to justify your decision with agreed ethical principles. Now, I also want you to consider that you, along with me, all of us as human beings, we possess two different types of thinking. And you might understand this intuitively. And I'm referring here to the work of the neuroscientist Daniel Kahneman, who's been very influential in the last 10 years. He describes that we think in two separate ways, and he calls it type 1 and type 2 thinking. In type 1 thinking, we default to a thing called heuristics. And heuristics are mental rules of thumb or mental shortcuts. An example of a heuristic it might be that, I'm thinking here about the reason why, in evolutionary terms, why we possess these mental rules of thumb. On the savannah, when we evolved as human beings, if we were hunting one day and we came across a lion in a patch of bush, and we ran away because of the lion, every time we approach that bush, we might think, oh no, there's a lion there. All right, so we start to avoid that area. That might be perfectly reasonable, but as lions might actually go from place to place to place around the savannah, it's actually not correct thinking. It's just a mental rule of thumb. Now, another example of a heuristic is if you're walking down the street and you see a group at night coming home from a nightclub, and you see a group of young men gathered around a corner, you might cross the road and walk on the other side of the road. Now, as you walk along, you glance to the other side of the road and you see these men are actually taking part in preparing for a religious ceremony. So they're not there to be a threat. But seeing threats, I think, is what a heuristic is, even though they're not logical ways of thinking, they're automatic and indeliberate ways of thinking. All right. So we tend to apply heuristics to moral calculations as well. So in ethics, these might be things such as applying purely mental intuition. So therefore, use of a framework or use of reflection or use of deliberation in ethics is an example of type 2 thinking. All right, the deliberate, slow, critical process of working things out, looking at different approaches, empathizing with other people, and so forth. Now, this is almost exactly the same as clinical reasoning. Now, there's two types of clinical reasoning. When we're in a hurry or an emergency, we tend to default to patterns that have worked for us in the past, or are automatic or are reflexive. But these aren't always the best decisions that are made. The best decisions are usually collaborative. They use reflection and self-analysis. They're deliberate, and we deliberate on a range of evidence-based sources and also discuss with the patient and the family. But this requires time. Okay. Now, finally, I just want to discuss this tool in light of a 20th century philosopher called John Rawls, and his theory of reflective equilibrium. So John Rawls was an influential philosopher in the second half of the 20th century, and he mainly worked in the ethics of justice. And if you're really bored, he's worth a read because he's got some really interesting things to say about distributive justice. And he's very influential in things like social work and sociology. Anyway, his idea of ethical reasoning was that top-down theory is really impractical as a guide in most circumstances. And he reasoned that the best bottom-up tool was to use reflective equilibrium. Now, this is just a fancy term for things like the application of the tool from that textbook, all right? And there's many tools out there, not just this one. I don't get paid like 20 cents every time you use this tool, by the way. You can use whatever tool you like, whatever works best for you. This is just a good one. Anyway, so all this is kind of like an application of the tool. The idea is to consider all the facts and principles and work backwards and forwards between them to tease out those elements that mutually support each other and that are obviously coherent to each other. For example, in the example above, I tested a range of moral theories and found consequentialism, non-maleficence, and respect for dignity to be those elements which are mutually supportive, and to be the overriding principles that I use. Now, in more complex cases, it might involve things like legal principles, the cultural concerns of the patients, their family, and their community. You might be looking at similar cases, so like casuistry stuff. You might look at common opinions between clinicians, etc., etc. There's many different resources you might use. Now, remembering the idea is not to win an argument, to win that ethical argument, because we're not debating this at in a philosophy department, but it's to come to reasonable, justifiable conclusions that are workable, and that this could even require a negotiated compromise between many parties. Now, obviously, in social dilemmas, this might not be so useful. For example, there may never be a compromise between anti-abortion activists and those that progress maternal rights. But usually in day-to-day ethical decision-making, there are pathways through, and empathy, deliberately considering a range of principles, compassion, and communicating with all parties goes a long, long way to find a workable ethical solution. Cheers.